welcome to the Construction Revolution podcast. My name is Stephen Rossi Zalmans, and here on the show, we explore the latest trends, technologies, people, and organizations that are revolutionizing or disrupting the construction industry and are changing what the industry will look like tomorrow. Today on the show, I'm speaking with Jake Olson, the CEO at Stratus. Jake is a licensed professional civil engineer with over 20 years in engineering and construction technology experience. He leads Stratus, a Colorado-based company that builds software for MEP contractors to digitize and automate their entire workflow, from design to fabrication to field installation. Their mission is to transform how the trades operate through data-driven contracting. All right. Hi, Jake. Welcome to the Construction Revolution podcast. How's it going today?
Good, Stephen. Happy to be here.
That's great. Yeah. I'm excited to learn more about you and learn about Stratus. So why don't you start off by telling me about what brought you from being an engineer and working at companies like DeWalt to leading Stratus?
I'll try to keep this tight because it's a meandering story. But to your point, I started life as an engineer, structural engineering here in the San Francisco area. Right around 2000 is when I started my professional career, which was, of course, the dot-com bubble had popped. So unfortunately, there was still a lot of construction going on. There wasn't a lot of design going on. So I quickly got into kind of the construction side of engineering, forensics, doing failure analysis on big things that were getting built. So I spent a lot of time in working actually on job sites in the construction capacity. The other benefit of being in the Bay Area is you're always exposed to technology, even back then. So quickly, I kind of became attached to some of the opportunities to bring technology into what I was doing and started working on, I guess, what we would call today is Contech or construction software. But I early on started working on building data acquisition systems, way to do structural testing with software versus just gauges, kind of manual stuff. And through that, I got hired at a building products company to do the same, do kind of R&D on new products design. That was called Powers Fasteners, and building software for the designers that were using these products as well. So really early on, built kind of my first exposure to construction tech, which was like an anchor design software back in 2005 or six. I did some entrepreneurial work, actually moved to Asia and started kind of a franchise of Powers in Asia. And then how we got to DeWalt is we ended up selling that company Powers to DeWalt back in 2012. So then I stayed for a while at DeWalt, continued doing kind of construction and software, worked on a couple big software programs for DeWalt. I built a tool called DeWalt HangerWorks, which was kind of an automated BIM. This was kind of the beginnings of my BIM journey as well in the 2010-12, but built a tool that did anchor design inside of Revit for MEP systems. And so I was there at DeWalt for a few years. Then I left and started my own company, which was called Dato. It was basically ChatGPT for construction before LLMs existed. So this was like 2017, 2018. And after I sold that company, I knew I wanted to build more construction software. So I went back and worked for a contractor for a year, just to make sure my ideas were correct and what I was going to spend my next time on. And so I worked for a big mechanical contractor called Binsky Mechanical in the Northeast, doing very large kind of MEP plumbing piping systems, mainly for healthcare, pharmaceutical world. And one of the tools that we used at Binsky to kind of turn this into more of a production type of workflow rather than just kind of what I call construction in the warehouse, the alternate is true kind of manufacturing. We were using Stratus at Binsky, and I knew the Stratus team well. So kind of through that, I had the opportunity to, number one, get really familiar with how to deploy Stratus and the advantages it can have to a contractor. But also I got very familiar with the Stratus team and the founders who I've known well. So when the opportunity came to take over Stratus as CEO, I kind of jumped at it because I really believed in the product and the vision for where the company needed to go to kind of keep up with the changes in MEP. So that's the meandering story, Stephen.
No, that's great. It's quite the journey, and you've been in the industry a long time and like at the cutting edge of tech for all of it. It sounds like, so that's great. I'm wondering, like, as a kind of serial entrepreneur almost, how has it been jumping into a company that you didn't found?
Yeah, that is the right question. Definitely different challenges for sure. So, I've built a few companies from the ground up, which you kind of get to put the pieces of the puzzle together as you go. So, who's on the team? What's the vision? What's the mission? What are we building and why? So, taking something over, all of that kind of exists, and there's some momentum from how the company was started. And you have to kind of quickly assess which parts of that existing culture and vision are correct and you need to carry forward. And then where you need to lay on your own vision and own people and own team. And, there's so talent assessment and strategy assessment and kind of across the board. That was a new challenge for me, an exciting one. I enjoyed that. The Stratus journey has been extremely rewarding, but definitely was a growth for me in making that transition. And we've got a world-class team and built on the existing vision and strategy for Stratus and kind of made it our own now. And I think the results are speaking for themselves. We're enjoying it, a great rapid growth and some fantastic customers getting lots of value from Stratus every day.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess as a CEO, like, are you finding you're bringing some of that background as an entrepreneur to do things a little differently than maybe someone more traditional would?
Yeah, I really do. That year of working with the product as an end user, being really boots on the ground in the fab shop with the BIM team on projects, trying to turn this whole MEP delivery system into more of a productionized workflow. Invaluable. Having been in that seat, I was a Stratus power user building out dashboards and workflows. So I wouldn't trade that for anything. I think that was a critical part of the success in this role. And then building companies and building teams is something I've done a lot of. And I think the combination of those two together is what's helping us really exceed here at Stratus.
Yeah, the being a user absolutely could make a huge difference. So for people who may not actually be familiar with Stratus or may not have used it as much as you have, can you tell me what is Stratus and who are the main users and your customers?
Yeah, Stratus is a tool for MEP contractors, so mechanical, electrical, plumbing. So you think about sheet metal, piping, plumbing systems, conduit, electrical, everything that gets put into a building. Our tool is basically a workflow tool. I like to say an operating system for MEP contractors that are using fabrication as part of their delivery. So, what does that mean? That means some level of what's getting built is being fabricated outside of the actual structure or building that's getting delivered. So, some people call that prefab, offsite fabrication, offsite modular, but when you're using some type of offsite or prefabrication as part of your delivery method as an MEP contractor, that's where Stratus comes in. And like I said, it's more than just a software solution. I like to tell people you're buying a process from us. Yes, there's a software that comes with it, but what we're really doing is selling you a new process or workflow to deliver your work. So think about Stratus as everything that happens between BIM, your 3D design that eventually is going to get built, everything that happens between BIM and then that final installation, sign off, testing, turnover. So we have to break that BIM down into kind of fabrication size chunks or components. Those have to get put into a fabrication queue, a workflow, different flows through the shop. Am I bending conduit? Am I welding pipe? Am I cutting sheet metal? Which tools am I going to use to do that? Which resources? What people are going to be involved? Do I have enough of those resources? So that whole kind of MRP, manufacturing resource planning type of concept. So breaking things down, fabricating them, tracking them. When you start moving fabrication offsite, you get into this big question is where is everything and what stage is it at? Did we cut the pipe already? Is it welded? Have we put the hangers on a cart? So being able to track status and kind of schedule through that whole process. Now, eventually, these need all this offsite fab has to get shipped. So there's a logistics piece to Stratus. How do we put these in batches and get them on the right trucks to the right job sites at the right time? And then finally, where do they go on site? So you imagine a big truck showing up with a bunch of fab, bunch of pieces of duct, for example. Where do those go within the building? Do they get delivered to the west gate? Do they go to the third floor? All those questions. And then when do they get installed? So you can imagine Stratus managing each step along the way, breaking that model into production packages, breaking those packages into discrete fabrication workflows, shipping, tracking, The real value here, though, Stephen, is once you've got that all running in Stratus, you basically now have a digital system. So no PDFs, no pieces of paper floating around. You have a digital system all the way through from BIM, fab, logistics, and install that my material runs through digitally. Now I get the KPIs or the data off of that process. And that's the big kind of transformation that our customers go through. You move from paper and spreadsheets and markers and stickers and pencils and everything to an actual digitized workflow. You'll know if you talk to me for a while, I'm a big into operations, kind of optimization and systems improvement. But once that's digitized, now I have the data to go back and actually start running like a continuous improvement type of process. So what's working, what's not? Where do I optimize? Let me, maybe I introduce some new material handling systems. Maybe I think about a new logistics optimization, field install. How big do we ship? How often do we ship? How do we work with our bills of materials and our suppliers? All those questions that a manufacturer thinks about when they're running production, it's kind of that for an MEP workflow. So
Yeah.
it's a lot. It's a true
Okay.
platform, but when it's implemented, it's kind of the results are kind of magical if you talk to our customers.
Yeah, no, I can see that. It sounds like it's a very elaborate solution, but I see like you're bringing everything together, and then once you have all the data in one spot, it's a lot easier to analyze and improve upon.
That's right.
So you touched on this a little bit in terms of like paper and construction. I know people in construction have some of the most elaborate spreadsheets that exist. Can you tell me, for someone who is not using Stratus yet, what would be a more traditional approach that an MEP contractor is using to do these same things right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. So most of the new customers that join us and start implementing Stratus, most of them have built what I call analog Stratus. So they've cobbled together because the problems exist, right? If you're going to start fabricating, you need to know where things are at, what status they're in, where they're at in my process. So you have to try to do something to figure that out. And that's what I was saying: spreadsheets, stickers, whiteboards, and all kinds of systems. And to turn that into anything that's repeatable, you kind of end up against the limits of your shared spreadsheets and your paper travelers. But so what most people will do, which is kind of crazy, they go through all this work to create a nice BIM, a nice model of what needs to get built, all the coordination work that happens, all the detailed modeling that happens. And then you've got this rich data sitting in a model. What happens before Stratus is then they go and they turn that into a PDF to be fabricated. So then you end up with these stacks of PDFs. And of course, as soon as you take a model, a live model, and you create a PDF, you've basically snapshotted that data at a point in time. So now you're disconnected from the reality of the model. And anybody who's been working on a fast paced, highly complex project knows that that model is not a static piece of design. Things change and owners change their minds and materials are available or not. So that model is kind of a living, breathing artifact that you can use to your benefit as a contractor. What the challenge is once you start creating PDFs off of that model, now you've snapshotted that model, you've lost the direct data connectivity back to the live model. And now you end up in this headache of change management and trying to keep track of where things are at, if there's a change. These are the problems I was talking about. What's fabricated? If the model changes, how much risk do we have? How many PDFs are floating out there that are no longer accurate anymore? And what parts of that have been fabricated, installed? So that is what, unfortunately, most people are dealing with before Stratus. And then each of those fabrication sheets goes in a PDF, and maybe they've come up with a color code. I've seen it all: colors of paint, colors of tape, colors of writing systems, markers, shared spreadsheets, smart sheets, home built. People have tried, a lot of, especially these days, everybody's trying to kind of build their own version to track all this. It's a difficult problem to solve, and if you're not intimately connected with that model in a way that the data is flowing back and forth between fabrication and back into your source of truth, which is your BIM, you end up in just the challenges of keeping everything up to date. But you also have the real challenge on the shop floor of, did I get enough data onto that piece of paper for somebody to actually do their job? And that's one of the early things that Stratus solves is, rather than trying to take all that rich model data and get it on a PDF, why not just give the fabricator access to the model data? So if there's a dimension they need, if there's a material spec they need, if there's a weld information they need, they have direct access to that model data rather than trying to hope that somebody upstream wrote the right stuff, the right dimension, the right view on a PDF. So our users work directly off the model data when they're fabricating, shipping, installing, which is a huge advantage to the existing workflows.
Right. Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. In construction and in trades, obviously the labor shortage and skilled labor specifically is no secret. How do these digital workflows like Stratus help to combat that?
Yeah, I think the probably the big advantage is just fabrication in general. And if you think about especially a lot of the big projects that we're building in the United States right now, they are mega projects in remote corners of the country, right? So think about a chip fab or a data center or even pharmaceutical production. These are getting built in areas that are already not dense with workers, construction labor. And secondly, because we're building so many of these, we have a shortage as well across the labor pool that you mentioned. The one way we can combat that is fabrication, offsite fabrication. So if I can take that chip fabrication facility and I break that down into chunks, move it off site, now I can tap into other labor pools. As an example, I've got a lot of big customers on the West Coast. There's not a ton of building going on and big projects going on in Seattle or San Francisco right now. But the contractors with fabrication capacity are as busy as they've ever been because they're able to tap into that labor pool and build fabrication according to these detailed specs that were in the model and ship it to wherever these things are getting built, whether that be Reno or Texas or Midwest, some of the hotter spots where we're building big stuff. So fabrication in general helps. The other advantage, if you think about it at the fab shop level, imagine a big project kind of an hour and a half away from a metropolitan area. The folks that can go work on that project, by nature, you're kind of limited. You've got either a long commute or you got to be willing to relocate or something like that. If I can move that labor into a facility, a known address that somebody can then drive to every single day, maybe closer to labor, you expand your labor pool right there. So maybe workers have to drop off kids or deal with sports or support family members or something like that. That's tough when you've got an hour and a half commute to some job site, which, by the way, might be another job site a year later, right? If you're in the field. By moving that labor into a facility where I can drive to the same address every day, I can tap into just a broader group of people that can do that type of work. So that's kind of second benefit to having a fab shop and moving labor into this fab shop. Not to mention that it's a controlled environment. You're not dealing with rain, heat, cold. You've got more of a controlled environment. So it's just an easier way to attract labor into that facility. And then Stratus specifically, obviously, we help enable that fabrication. We help optimize it. And then along the way, we also help reduce some of so I talked about creating those paper PDFs, right? And that's a limited resource. Somebody can go into Revit or a modeling tool and do all of these detail sheets. Some people call them spool sheets, but basically there's a whole bunch of people usually involved in just creating those paper instructions for the fab shop. When I put Stratus in place, the amount of labor needed to do that kind of tedious pulling dimensions, it goes way down. And that's a limited resource for a lot of these contractors to grow. So we're able to help them grow their business without having to go hire a bunch of detailers, a bunch of extra BDC people, which is usually a difficult constraint on growth. So there's some very kind of direct impacts that Stratus can help reduce these kind of very limited labor. But more importantly, we enable this fabrication as part of the delivery method, which is where you get the big advantages in the labor pool.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And it's different from a lot of ones I've heard before. I asked that question quite a bit. And it's kind of tackling it from both sides, as you mentioned. So moving on, as we were doing some research, we saw that you published a state of MEP report and it interviewed a bunch of MEP contractors and executives. Just curious to know, what did you find by doing that and how did you go about it?
That's funny. We've got a lot of MEP contractors using our software, hundreds. And the questions, of course, everybody wants to know, how am I doing against other people? And at some point we realized we've got a pretty good insight into the industry as, probably one of the largest MEP softwares in operating in North America. So we've got a lot of great insights, just kind of anecdotally, but we realized that there was going to be value in trying to make that into a more kind of valid statement, not just what we're hearing. So We kicked off this research project end of last year. We're going to do it again. This will be an annual report that we put out. But we targeted the executives at, the top MEP contractors in North America and focused on several types, kind of broad business questions. How are you doing? What's your outlook on the future? What's growing? What's working? What's not? We focused on some very specific financial kind of KPI type questions. How do you measure your business? What's trending the right way? What's not? And then kind of technology-based things. Where are you investing? What are you looking for? So got a lot of great insights. It's available on our website if anybody wants to dig into that. But the two big learnings that weren't super obvious to me until we did this is that the bigs are getting bigger, is what I like to say. And actually, that anecdote about the West Coast contractors growing their business, that's a great one. The MEP contractors that were big enough to have a good fabrication workflow in place have been enjoying a unprecedented boom, probably a generational boom in their businesses in the last 3, 4, 5 years. So they've been able to participate in this big MEP boom that's going on in North America, even if they're geographically not in the right place. In order to be at that tier, though, you had to be big enough. You had to have had enough kind of capital investment in fabrication to be ready to help build, for example, a data center module in San Jose that's going to get shipped to Abilene, Texas, or something like that. So the folks that were at that capacity, though, they've got an unprecedented demand in their business, and that really shook out in the data. You talk about how did they do last year? What's their prospect on the future? How are they looking at things? The bigger tier contractors are having the time of their life right now. Where some markets, and you can see that in the data as well, geographically, if you're a smaller MEP contractor, maybe no fabrication, you're more of an installer type of thing, and you were geographically in a market that didn't have a lot of new construction going on. Some people really had hard years in the last couple of years. That was a trend that I think we kind of sensed, but it really was interesting to see how pronounced that was, how much growth there was in the big contractors versus the little ones. And then the second one that is near and dear to my heart is we dug in a lot on KPIs. How do you run your business? What are the metrics? And my undergrad was industrial engineering. I've had a lot of time to work in kind of operational excellence type of settings through manufacturing. And I'm kind of passionate about running good data-driven businesses. And it was really interesting to see the gap. And a lot of contractors are measuring financial performance on jobs, but it's kind of after the fact, looking backwards. Okay, how did we do on the job? What did we make? What was our margins on the job? So we looked at things like who's measuring what? Do you know your work in progress, your cost on labor versus materials? But most of what people are tracking are kind of after the fact metrics when they're able to kind of count the numbers. Very few contractors were actually using more forward-thinking operational metrics where they can actually drive outcomes. Like a real-time analysis. Imagine I'm a mechanical contractor with several different systems. Maybe I'm doing plumbing, which includes some copper and some cast iron. Maybe I'm doing some sheet metal, some spiral duct, square duct. Maybe I've got some welded pipe and some groove pipe. So I've got all these different systems. Which ones are making money at a system level? Which ones are not? Which of my process changes have had a positive impact? Am I going to think about a different way to deliver hangers? Maybe I'm going to prefab the lengths of the rods, or I'm going to just send them along to the job site and let the guys in the field cut them. Those are two things we can test. We can run a continuous improvement theory on that. But if I don't have the real-time system level data, I'm not able to take that back and actually improve my business real time. Logistics was another one. How many people are actually running a good operational discipline on the logistics? So when you see the report, you'll see how much gap and what I would call kind of table stakes operational metrics. They're just a lot of contractors are struggling to put those in place. I think part of it is that data is hard to come by. If you're running a paper-based workflow, you got spreadsheets everywhere. Every PM is measuring and doing percent completes differently. You have a hard time actually measuring that end to end. How much did it cost to install the copper on floor 2? That's a hard question for a lot of contractors to answer other than just kind of a blanket guess at it. So that shook out in the MEP report too. So yeah, I'm excited. We're going to kick off the next one in a few months. We're already kind of putting it together, but we're going to go deeper on measuring these metrics. How do you measure them? And we don't have time to get into all of that today, but it's one thing to say I measure weld inches per hour in like a weld shop. It's another thing to agree on how you measure that and the differences are vast. So
Right.
our next cut at this, we're going to get deeper into how things are measured, not just what do you measure. But it was
Right.
really an interesting set of data, and we're excited to keep working on those over the next few years on different takes on the state of MEP.
That's great. And it's you're in a unique perspective to be able to do that. And also great that you're not just kind of refreshing the data every year. You're looking at diving deeper and changing what you're finding each year. That's awesome.
Yep, yep.
So to sort of wrap things up here, if we, as technology and as Stratus grows and also just technology adoption in construction is up and there's technology here, there, and everywhere for just about everything now. I'm curious, as someone who has worked in the industry, how do you see MEP contracting evolving over the next, let's say, 5, even 10 years?
I do think the trend to be more operationally focused, I like to call it production system thinking, but really thinking about your business not as a collection of 20 job sites that are kind of independently run, but as a true production system that starts in estimating and design through fabrication and then finally field install. Thinking about that as a system and then putting the right metrics in place to optimize that system. I see that happening certainly at the top tier contractors, and then more and more that seems to be spreading. You don't have to be a $1 billion mechanical to put those processes in place. In fact, some of the most innovative stuff I'm seeing is in the smaller folks that can pivot and move a little faster and really adopt this. I do think MEP is going to move into more of an optimized system where we're running these businesses more like a true end-to-end operation rather than 20 different job sites, just hoping on average we make money at the end of the year when those 20 sites are finished. That's kind of operational thinking. It's going to require some different skill sets, logistics management, manufacturing mindsets, quality control, pieces that larger manufacturers have gone through. And I don't want to say blanketly MEP is going to look like manufacturing because it's not. It is different than manufacturing. There are different inputs and different outputs that are nothing like a car plant or something like that. However, that doesn't mean there aren't some parts that rhyme with manufacturing that we can't learn from. And that's kind of the skill here. How do we take pieces that have been well studied, have good kind of techniques around them, and then bring the relevant pieces into our fabrication shops? Some people call that industrialized construction, but that's definitely a trend I see more of. I do think the big MEP boom, especially around data centers. So if you're building data centers today, you're basically doing a lot of offsite fabrication, modular work. I do think that will have a lasting impact on the entire industry because once you get those processes in place, once you start thinking more operationally focused, the next job that shows up that's not a data center, maybe it's a hospital, maybe it's a McDonald's, who knows? You're not going to forget the fact of how you optimize work for the data center, right? And I'm seeing this already. More people thinking around offsite fab, modularization, systems thinking on how they're going to design. And of course, that's going to be underpinned by technology. The ability to have a construction level BIM unlocks a lot of this. And that's getting easier than ever. I think we'll continue to see automation on the design side where cost to create this BIM is decreasing just through better tools, more experience. So as we get better at building 3D models of exactly what needs to get built, down to millimeter level accuracy, bills of material that are exactly what we need to buy, costing information that's exactly what this thing should take to build, with good feedback loops so those continue to improve. That alone is going to unlock a lot of downstream technology that'll continue to drive more of an operational approach to building things.
Oh, that's a great take. I think the connected data and learning from that data and modular construction for sure, like, is a big thing. So lastly then, if people are interested in learning more about Stratus, where should they go? And then also, if they're looking to sort of get started, obviously it's a pretty elaborate solution. What does that initial process look like to get onboarded?
We've done this now with hundreds of contractors, so I wouldn't say we're done refining that process. It's going to continue to evolve, but we've gotten pretty good at getting people onboarded. We've got an unbelievable team that supports Stratus. So stratus.build is our website. You can book a demo there and you'll get in touch with one of our sales engineering team will get in touch, get a good assessment of what you're doing today, what's working, what's not, and then kind of overlay what would that look like in the Stratus future. And look, Stratus is not for everybody. So a lot of our job there is telling people, hey, this is not for you either yet or maybe even ever, depending on the type of work they're doing. That's part of that process. But once we determine it would be a good fit, then we put a true implementation plan in place. And Like this business wouldn't work unless we're able to make that as painless as possible for our end users. We have a whole onboarding education program that we put different, depending on your role, we put you through. But the real goal is to get ROI as fast as possible. So if you make the investment, yes, there's software costs, but the real investment you're making is the time. And that ROI needs to happen as fast as possible. So we put a lot of focus on getting to first value, making sure the customer feels like the time that they've put into changing their process, changing their flows is got a good ROI back for the business. We're pretty proud of how well we're able to get people up to speed quickly. And that's all. I can't take much credit for that, as the team that we have working in that is absolutely world class. So most of the folks you talk to have actually worked in contractors, have implemented Stratus, know what's around the corner, know the pain points and pitfalls. So we're able to weave you through that as quick as possible. So it's going well. Stratus.build, and then there's a little button. You can book a demo, and we'll get you into that process if you're interested.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for your time, and looking forward to seeing the future of Stratus.
Thanks, Stephen. Pleasure.